So I'll preface this review by saying that I've never played Final Fantasy VII. It's currently sitting on my PS Vita, waiting to be played for the first time, so I go into the remake with no nostalgia, no preconceived expectations, without thinking whether it could possibly do justice to what is many people's greatest game of all time. I have no nostalgia goggles on and will be reviewing the game as it is and how it plays within the gaming landscape of today. I've never been the biggest Final Fantasy fan, having played numerous entries in the series, but they just never clicked with me. Final Fantasy VII Remake was a fantastic gaming experience for myself, and although it does fall down in several areas, almost falling through the floor in some places, it manages to pick itself up and deliver a great gaming experience for long-time Final Fantasy fans, but also delivers what I believe to be the best Final Fantasy game for new players to get into the series. So whether you're trying your hardest to save the beautifully realised Midgar, hunting down giant yellow chickens, making your way through a ridiculous QTE sequence, or engaging in side quests which made me want to stick my head in a vice and slowly tighten it, Final Fantasy VII Remake is almost everything I wanted it to be. But let's delve into what it does well, what it does not so well, and where Square Enix needs to realise some things don't cut it in modern gaming anymore. We'll start with the visual presentation. Final Fantasy VII Remake overall is a great looking game with fantastic cutscenes and character models, and a whole host of lighting effects which dance and jump around the screen until you almost have a seizure from just how busy that screen can sometimes become. Then you summon Ifrit, who is received by playing the main campaign, and it's at that time where you might want to almost check yourself in to see a doctor, as the lighting and quick camera movements is an absolute assault on the senses. The character models are highly detailed, and although they aren't the best I've seen recently, they aren't aiming to be super realistic, and they strike a great balance between being realistic and more anime inspired. Each of the main characters has the same attention to detail put into them, and considering just how many hours of cutscenes you'll be watching, I'm glad that so much was put into them. And we're talking many hours of simply watching. The amount of cutscenes in Final Fantasy VII Remake is like watching the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The extended cuts, the ones where 3 hours per movie just wasn't enough. The large amount of NPCs, weapons and items also have a good amount of detail attached to them, even though they do lack the detail of the main character models. But the other area which was overall impressive is that of the environment. Now, this can be broken down into two parts. The first thing I'll say is that the actual place of Midgar and everything it includes I found to be simply amazing. It had a very lived-in feel, and even though the slum areas are split into different sectors, and for example, the wall market is similar to a red light district, as opposed to Sector 7, which feels more residential and dirtier, and these contrast with the greenery which can be seen at Aerith's house. The poorer areas of the slums are also contrasted with the huge pillar and support pillars which almost constantly remain in view of players, where the wealthier residents live. As we play through the campaign, we get to see what those residents see as we gaze down upon the shantytown brown landscape which extends off into the distance. And this is perhaps the main area where Final Fantasy VII Remake takes a hit in the graphics department. There are many textures that look very low res and have this blurry look to them, like the game is trying to load the proper texture, but it never appears. What we are left with is a mishmash where the game can look fantastic, but then also a little average. And that's even in the same scene. We have these high detailed character models set against a backdrop of some textures smeared in Vaseline. It's quite jarring, and when we get the chance to look down on the slums from up high, it reminded me of having pre-rendered backgrounds in games before the onset of high-quality 3D graphics. If anyone remembers the market town from Zelda Ocarina of Time, it reminded me of that. The poor textures aren't limited to a certain area or part of the game, as they crop up almost everywhere, during cutscenes, regular gameplay, when running around, and even in boss fights. It's almost as if the dev team ran out of time or money to bring them up to a higher standard, like the rest of Final Fantasy VII Remake. They really stick out because the rest of the game can look and perform so well. I didn't see any major or even minor performance issues that I could notice, as the game was very stable, whether that be walking around the game world or when in battle with a boss and several other enemies and teammates all on screen at once, with all of the lighting effects going on as well. It's unfortunate that many textures weren't improved before release, but it's a small price to pay to have consistent performance. But even with the problems with the visual presentation of Final Fantasy VII Remake, the game is still graphically impressive overall. There are lots of chests and items to find off the beaten path, so exploring as much as possible is recommended. But one aspect I found somewhat confusing though was that there are several items such as boxes, crates and chairs for example, which can be either destroyed or interacted with as you run through them or hit them with your sword. But then there are other objects that can't be interacted with at all, like everything is made of the heaviest steel you could possibly find, then it was all bolted down to the floor, then they welded it all together, including the floor. These parts had a look but don't touch feel about them, which was odd, and it reminded me of games from years gone by at times where it could look nice, but interaction and any sorts of physics were kept to an absolute minimum or were non-existent altogether. When it comes to sound, everything is as it should be, and when in combat, that's when the sound effects are at their best. Hearing the clash of your sword as it comes into contact with enemies is great, as is the sound of gunfire, especially from Barrett's weapon, but casting spells I felt could have had some more attention to make them feel a little bit more special. Considering these can be upgraded into more powerful versions, I found they lacked anything really meaningful in the sound department to let me know that they were actually better than the standard spell I was using before. Dialogue is done very well and fits in with the look, feel and tone of a Final Fantasy game, but it's also classic JRPG, and for someone like myself, it can go over the top at times, such as when characters are constantly laughing for no real reason, but the quality of the script can also fluctuate between the fantastic and the average. The biggest issue I had when it came to sound was in the lip syncing, where I found the character mouths were constantly ever so slightly out of sync with what they were saying. It wasn't pronounced enough to ruin the experience, but it was definitely there, and I tend to notice issues like these very easily. But there is no way the sound of Final Fantasy VII Remake can be discussed without mopping up the drool that comes with listening to its soundtrack. It may possibly be the most diverse and eclectic mix of music I've heard in a video game. It rides an audio wave between rock, electronic and classical, but then it can also change up the various tracks depending upon the situation that it's being used in. Multiple tracks can be played concurrently, with one getting greater significance based upon what is occurring on screen. There is such variety that the tone and music can change very quickly from one scene to the next, or in the same scene itself. Really, if your ears could eat, they would be feasting on one of the best and most diverse soundtracks in recent years. On a side note though, there were a few scenes where the music drowned out the voices, so you might want to play around with the audio volume levels, but it wasn't too much of a problem. So, it's a good looking game, has great performance, and Midgar itself has a fantastic mesh of cyberpunk, sci-fi, and a little steampunk thrown in, and it sounds great. But what are the story and characters like? Well, they're actually pretty damn great as well. The story centers around our playable spiky-haired character known as Cloud Strife, an ex-soldier of the Shinra Electric Power Company, who has built large reactors which power the city of Midgar. These run off Mako, which Shinra drains from the planet. As Cloud, you join the environmental terrorist group of Avalanche as you look to take down Shinra and stop their planet-sucking ways. There are some twists and turns throughout, and I was generally interested in the story and how it dealt with the themes of protecting the environment and the role corporations have in a society, but also how much control they can have and the responsibility that goes along with that. I found Final Fantasy VII Remake to brush over these themes more than delve deep into them, and it was in keeping with the feel of the game. But one reason why I enjoyed the Final Fantasy VII Remake more than other games in the series, and most recently with Final Fantasy 15, was that I found the game quite linear, and it worked in its favour in creating a story and characters I was genuinely interested in. It stayed relatively focused, and I never lost sight as to what I was meant to be doing, and never forgot story elements, as everything blended together quite well, and once I'd finished it, I just wanted more. I wanted to keep playing and to keep advancing the story, but not everything is sunny in Midgar, and that's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we have the almost completely uninteresting side quests, which make players often complete the most mundane tasks and prove just how archaic Final Fantasy VII Remake is when you aren't following the main story. Whether you're finding some lazy guy's chocobos, or chasing cats or dogs or bears or birds, or some other form of animal life, it's enough to make your brain dead. And yeah, a couple of those are made up, but you get my point. If the game had more interesting and more multi-layered side quests, then it would have truly delivered an amazing game, whether following the main story and getting lost in the side quests as well. I also found that the rewards weren't often good enough for me to keep playing through these, but the main story itself is deep, with new parts getting shown to the player all the time up until the end. I'd be lying if I said I understood everything right away or that everything is neatly tied up. It's not, but it still works, and I wasn't left feeling like it abruptly ended for myself. The other issue I had with the game, definitely more than some low-res textures, is the amount of times the game wants to strip control away from the player for no real reason. For example, the game will transition between cutscene and gameplay only for me to walk about 10 meters before having another cutscene or having my character be forced to walk to where the game is telling me to go. Now, I have no issue with long cutscenes in games. I would have rather sit through a longer cutscene rather than having control given back to me only to be ripped away such a short time later. There is one part of the game, around the halfway point in the main story, where this occurred far too often, and it also wasn't being broken up by much combat either. I hope these transitions are used far less in the next installment, that's for sure. Now when it comes to characters, there is a goofiness and a kind of innocence that exists with most of the characters, and it overall works well, but there are times when that goofiness went overboard with a couple of characters. One thing that needs a mention is that the main females in this game must be some of the nicest people to ever exist. The likes of Tifa and Aerith mainly, but also Jessie. Considering Cloud himself is a bit of a moody bastard at times, it's surprising they're so damn nice most of the time to him, as he also comes across as a bit of a knob as well, especially more towards the start of the game, but he did grow on me more and more, and I wanted to see how his character was going to grow and also exactly what was going on with him. Tifa and Aerith can hold themselves when in a fight, and then we also have Barrett, your typically huge, bulky, muscular guy who's built like a friggin' house and who has a machine gun for an arm. It's like Square Enix took the manliest men on Earth and spliced their genes together to make Barrett. He also has a young daughter, which allows players to see a lot more human side of him. Outside of these more tender scenes, he doesn't so much as speak to other characters as he yells at them, just in lesser decibels. I wanted to learn more of these characters and see if they would change at all over the course of the game and what other information I'd find out in order to flesh them out or their character arc. I got this to a certain extent, but considering this remake isn't the full game, I'd expect more in this department come the next installment. And now we get to the combat and action of the game. I've never really been a fan of turn-based combat, so the fact that Final Fantasy VII is in real time is a major plus for me. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a blend of real-time and turn-based combat, but players are able to choose spells, abilities and items during a fight, and this will see everything go in slow motion until something has been selected. The combat itself is fast, fluid, and it's also quite simplistic overall, but it does have some added depth due to an increased difficulty, enemy and spell variety, plus the different weapons each of the party members has access to. The difficulty of Final Fantasy VII Remake is quite balanced, and on the higher settings, players will need to manage their abilities and spells much more, mostly being the most effective time to use them so you aren't too vulnerable, and also correctly assessing your opponents as to know their weaknesses. Now, if you're looking to play on easy, just know that the game isn't lying about that setting. It's easy. Anyone who is half skilled will get through regular enemies without breaking a sweat, and rarely even needing to use very many items at all, such as health potions. Bosses will present a little more of a challenge, but nothing that is difficult, and really, on easy, you can almost play the game as a button masher and more action oriented. And speaking of the bosses, I found some to go on for far too long, but the combat and boss fights are helped when playing on normal difficulty, as it forces players to incorporate more of the depth that the combat system offers. Players can also switch between teammates to use their different abilities and spells, and also able to upgrade those abilities, as well as increasing your health points and magic. As your spells increase in potency, so too does their cost to cast them. When in combat, you'll have an ATB gauge in the lower right corner, and this is split into two sections. By attacking enemies, this will fill up, and then players can use the command menu in order to cast those spells, use items, and the different abilities. And at this time, the fight is slowed down to a crawl, and you'll have plenty of time to make a decision as to what you wish to use. This quick combat system and choosing different abilities kept the combat pretty enjoyable throughout the whole game, and there was never really a time where I grew tired of it. It isn't the most complex system out there, but it has enough variety between spells, abilities, and the different characters that I enjoyed continually taking part in battle. There are several weapons which Cloud can equip throughout the main story, whether they are found or bought from the various shops and kiosks around the place, but I pretty much stuck to the starting weapon of the Buster Sword, as I just think it looks so sleek. Combat and customization is further enhanced with the inclusion of materia. This item can be found or bought, and is used to modify weapons and armor to make them more powerful. It can also be used to buff your character, such as being able to auto-heal during combat or cast certain types of spells. It is split up into several different categories like healing, fire, revival, barrier, ice, or assess, which allows players to find out an enemy's weakness and the best way to attack them. These are just a few examples of materia, and there are a lot more to find or purchase during the game, and they can be equipped to each of the characters. Which ones you favour will depend on the character build you're going for and which ones are best suited to each character. I did wish there was a jump button many times just to mix up movement during and out of combat, and especially considering Cloud seems to jump and fly around so much during cutscenes, but during gameplay he can't make his way over such small objects in his way. But I also didn't like the lack of iframes, whereby rolling and moving whilst an enemy is firing some projectiles at you doesn't do anything, so you constantly take damage or needing to block. I felt it would just enhance the combat further by giving more options. So, would I recommend Final Fantasy VII Remake to non-Final Fantasy fans or those who aren't into JRPGs in general? Well, yes, I would. There is enough story and content that it's worthwhile playing, and even for those who are just curious about this much beloved franchise or game, may find that Final Fantasy VII Remake is the best one to start with. It's quite linear, has some great action and characters, but is also lengthy enough for you to really sink your teeth into this great game world. This is the first installment for the reimagining of Final Fantasy VII Remake, but anyone who tells you it isn't worth full price or isn't a complete game isn't worth listening to. I just hope we don't have to wait too long for the follow-up.